That's better. Yeah, I think. Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Yeah. I could still do that. I mean, that was only a week or so ago. Oh, that's good. Doing it. Yeah. People I know. I mean, David Jones.
Near the appointed hour. Let's start with a moment of quiet and then we'll get kicking. Well, thank you for hanging out for these several months. Hard to believe that what we began in the cold of January, we end in the cold of May. It's been a fun series, and I knew when I saw the first blackberries blooming that cold was coming. Blackberry winter was going to be on the way, and evidently there's like almost 2 feet of snow in West Virginia. It's crazy. Uh, but after 5 months, I think the cafeteria has finally figured out when I'm wandering through that I'm not some interloper, and I've almost figured out how to order a meal. The first time I was there in January, I had no idea that there was a new regime here, and I just went up to the counter and picked up a plate and went back to our table. Somebody went missing a dinner that day, and I finally, I think, have figured it out. But just in case, the good folk here have written everything out for the cafeteria staff, saying he's legit, he's legit. So I look forward to joining some of you for lunch and further conversations. Today, of course, we end with the 80s. I'm not quite sure why Friends Homes decided to cut it off at the 80s, but they probably figured you all remembered the 90s and where they were in trouble if they tried to do too much. But I'm in trouble because you folk remember the 80s very well. So I'm hoping that you will fact check me on some of what I'll be describing and add in. I've already let Charlie know that he's going to have to kick in with some detail about the expansion into Friends Homes West because he was very much involved with that. Well, as we start off, as we have in the last decades, we'll take a look at what was happening at Friends Homes. Then we'll take a look at what was happening in the wider world, what was happening in the local Quaker community, and how were Quakers relating to some of those events. So we'll kick off with what was happening at Friends Homes, and there was a lot in the decade of the 80s. First off, the residential care unit, now named Elizabeth Fry, was developed in 81. And then in 83, Wilson Sheldon came as administrator. Most of you remember Wilson. I think he and his family moved into Arcadia, didn't they? And when Arcadia was facing New Garden Road, it was later in the 90s, or maybe later than that, when they picked that thing up on a ill-advised, cheap moving company and moved it to where it is now. But the initial company, the axle broke, and I think that house sat in the mud for about 8 months before they got another legit company. But anyway, Wilson Sheldon was a graduate of Wilmington College. Anyone else here alum of Wilmington College? Not North Carolina, Ohio. Your husband? Yeah, a little Quaker college in Southwest Ohio that's produced some pretty amazing folk in addition to Wilson Sheldon. Brent Bill, noted author. I'm trying to think. Michael Burkle, another Quaker author and a retired theology professor and Quaker history professor, Earlham. And of course, Thomas Kelly, the famous Quaker spiritual writer's product of Wilmington, as well as Gary Sandy. Okay, Gertrude knows Gary Sandy. Anyone else know Gary Sandy? He was one of the cast of WKRP in Cincinnati. Right up there with the pantheon of Quaker spiritual writers.
No, Steve Pothoff.
Steve Pothoff from New Garden is a professor there now. At the time of Wilson Sheldon's coming as administrator, there was a $3 million budget. Anybody know what the budget is now for Friends Homes? It's probably a little north of 3 million. And there were 95 full-time employees, which I think is now a little north of maybe several hundred, probably. Marie Brown succeeded Helen Stanfield as the director of admissions in '86. And Marie just, how many years ago retired? Not that long ago. And Margaret Coltrane retired in '88 after her long service as a director of social services. And it was, I was reading David Stanfield's history of Friends Homes. It was fascinating, all the things that Margaret Coltrane did. Evidently, if new residents came from fairly, sketchy places and hadn't been that attentive to cleanliness, she cleaned all of their possessions before they moved into their new residence. She helped develop the landscaping and the nature trails here. She developed the library, and evidently she baked birthday cakes for folk. Any of you a recipient of a birthday cake from Margaret Coltrane? You're way too young for that, evidently. Now, one of the other significant things that Margaret did was that she invited Eleanor Moscovitz to join the staff in developing musical opportunities. And again, Eleanor only retired recently herself, but she still comes back to do special programs, doesn't she? And I remember coming in early for different programs, and she'd be here with her little groups of musical folk. It was also during the '80s that the Eden Alternative was developed. Now, is that through all the different campuses now, or only in certain areas? What's that? Oh, hey. Now, when you talk about Eden Alternative, putting down, we had to put down several of our dogs, but I don't think that's what it means. But they ended that, laid it down. Yeah. And yeah.
I was in the dog committee
Oh, you're in the dog committee? Yeah.
when Quakers, I can't think of his first name. He and I headed up the dog committee
Okay.
for Eden.
So evidently the Eden Alternative has gone to the dogs now.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it was all, but evidently the beauty shop is still going. That was developed during the '80s. And also the gift shop. And the gift shop, does it still sell your book, Gertrude? Okay, so rush down to the gift shop and buy Gertrude's book. In 1989, there's a feasibility study for a second campus. And Carolina Glenn optioned 40 acres of the Coble property and built a model unit to start selling units for a previous retirement community. And they disappeared, evidently, with the money and were later convicted of fraud. So the land was available. Any of you remember that? Have any other details of that? Evidently, it was some sort of a Ponzi scheme that Carolina Glenn did. They bought the property and then optioned off, built that model unit. And that model unit later on became the sales building, I think, for the new units of what's now Friends Homes West Campus, where Charlie, we'll say a bit more about this in a moment, hung out for hours and hours and hours daily and weekly. But anyway, that developer disappeared with the money. They had purchased the land for about $2.5 million, and then off they went. But Wood and Court Architects then came in and designed 171 apartments, 28 for assisted living, and 19 nursing units for the expansion into Friends Homes West there on that Coble property. And if you've been down to the boardroom down that way, you've probably seen the historical diorama of Wilson Sheldon and the landscape architect who was, let me think, Heath Carrier, evidently, surveying that pasture field with the barn in the background. And it was open farmland. I can still remember cattle grazing there when we first came down in the 90s and laying out, what would become Friends Homes West. Uh, the Rittenbach construction was awarded the contract in 91. So Charlie was asking, when did construction start? It was evidently around 91 when they broke ground. And the people who broke ground were Seth Henshaw, General Secretary of North Carolina Yearly Meeting FUM, Tom Wright, the chair of the board, Wilson Sheldon, Vic Nussbaum, then mayor of Greensboro, and Howard Coble, our congressman at the time. They were all in construction hats turning over dirt. And 34.5 million in bonds were floated to finance the operation. According to David Stanfield, Charlie Ruth spent 60-hour weeks for 18 months marketing those apartments. You want to say anything more about that, Charlie?
You got it there. There, I enjoyed the time very much so, and to meet the people, it was great. It was great back then.
Charlie was telling me that some people balked at the $250,000 entrance fee, and one person who balked, Charlie said, found out later on it was worth about $7 million. Was trying to bargain down, but that building that Charlie practically lived in for 18 months is now a storage facility over next to New Garden Meeting. And evidently, it's quite a story of that thing getting picked up and moved through Forbes and Dick's woods to settle over there. And that was the office out of which Hayes Ratledge quite often sold plots to folk in the cemetery. But the buildings went up, and during construction, 4 of the subcontractors went bankrupt because of problems there. Anything else you could say about that, Charlie? No, better left unsaid. But there they are now, and quite expanded and filling up pretty rapidly. I've seen moving vans over there quite a bit with the new construction. Well, locally, what was going on? Well, still somewhat rural in character. I can remember when I came down in 90, they were still baling hay on the Waynick property on Guilford's back campus, where Eagle Physicians is now, and the Guilford farm is operating. And on further down, where Elwood spent his summers, just across from the Jefferson Pilot Country Club, they were baling hay on the Hodgen property, where there was a Lutheran church and a few homes and a few decrepit barns. And of course, all of that is now Lowe's Food and shopping center, and much of that is still in the process of getting developed. That Lowe's Foods site, by the way, in the former Hodgen farm, that used to be the farm of Horace Cannon. Horace Cannon was a medical doctor in the Quaker community into the 1830s, and like most Quakers down here, packed up in the late 1830s and headed to Indiana, where they settled in Park County, western part of Indiana, where a lot of North Carolina Quakers, including a lot of my relatives, settled. And their son, Joseph Gurney Cannon, went off to Friends Boarding School in Richmond, now Earlham College, one of the first classes of what's now Earlham College, and went on to get a law degree and practiced law in Eastern Illinois and represented his congressional district in Congress for 46 consecutive years, and became Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1903 to 1911, and was on the cover of the first Time magazine. That's Joseph Gurney Cannon. And he grew up where Lowe's Foods is now, evidently. Somebody recently told me, and I don't know where they saw this recorded, but that in his later life, Joseph Gurney Cannon came back to visit the old home place and saw it in a very decrepit condition, said, "Get me out of here." He just was not impressed. He would be, I don't know if he'd be impressed with Lowe's Foods or not. Friendship Meeting House. When any of you from Friendship know when you moved out of the Moon Room into that house on New Garden? 1987. Okay, so it's that decade. And is a new meeting house going up anytime soon? Is that still under discussion? Yes, we hope so. And in 1988, New Garden Meeting constructed their new meeting house adjacent to the former new meeting house that was built after Dana Auditorium was built. And they moved out of New Garden Hall, now administration building at Guilford, across the street for a larger room. The architect of the new meeting house was Mather Lippincott, a Philadelphia Quaker who designed a lot of the apartments at Pendle Hill and a lot of other construction up there. And evidently, from the story I've heard, and others can confirm or deny this, his impression of Southern Quakers was that they wanted church buildings. New Garden wanted a traditional meeting house patterned after those Chester County meeting houses from which New Garden came in the 1700s, and kept presenting designs to the building committee at New Garden, kept rejecting them, saying, "No, we want a traditional meeting house." And they finally got it, including all those multiple doors, which fascinate folk who thought that Quakers had a testimony on simplicity. And we have way more doors than one would think necessary. And being good Quakers, we don't label them as to which door you go in. And honest to goodness, in 91, when I was down here after coming to start campus ministry program at Guilford, one of the students I've been working with was a senior, Roman Catholic, who'd never been to a Protestant service. And she said, my senior year, I probably ought at least go to a Quaker meeting. And I said, well, you're welcome to come to New Garden. And at the time, the bushes around that new meeting house hadn't grown up, so I could see through the windows. I watched her come across campus and go to the scramble line. I said, Anne's finally coming. And she crossed over New Garden Road, tried that door, that door, that door, that door, and that door before she gave up and went back to Guilford before finding the door that she used to go into the building. I've told that story to folk at New Garden. They still have not labeled the doors, but it's how we keep the numbers down. Yeah. Have any of you tried that before? Any of you new folk to New Garden come in through the wrong door? On occasion, people will come in, someone's speaking up front through one of those doors behind the facing benches, and are kind of shocked to come in that way.
I knew people tried to come to my mother's funeral through the wrong building.
Yeah. So long as when you die, you don't go through the wrong door then. But anyway. The yearly meeting offices eventually were moved to West Friendly. I'm not sure when exactly that happened. Of course, the yearly meeting office used to be in that house next to the parsonage, and that's been torn down recently. But anyone know when they went to that office building on Friendly? They were still there in the 90s when I was there, but might have been in the 80s, but they were there. And the annual sessions of North Carolina Yearly Meeting were still held on campus in Dana Auditorium, with some of the representative body and ministry and council meetings being over at New Garden Meeting. And I miss those days when, we still had our differences, but there was still kind of a conviviality of those sessions in Dana, and folk would bring in watermelons, and they would, share watermelon after sessions and ice cream and things like that. And Charlie Hendricks would carry trays in the cafeteria for folk. And, in fact, I missed the yearly meeting, period. I mean, it's not just the sessions that have moved. That yearly meeting has dissolved into different associations. But that's, I was just chatting with Dan Allen before we started. We were at Quaker Men's Banquet and it was a banquet. I've never seen so much food catered since the last potluck I went to at a Quaker meeting uh, at Cedar Square. And even though the yearly meeting, Friends United meeting, has dissolved, there are still organizations that insist on being inclusive. Quaker Men, the United Society of Friends Women, Friends Disaster Service, Quaker Lake. And so fortunately, and FEMAP, right, Friends Emergency Material Assistance Program that Mary gave a wonderful report about at Quaker Men. So fortunately, those organizations still are inclusive, and it's fun to see our old friends that we don't see at yearly meeting sessions anymore. Uh, the 80s also began the tenure of Bill Rogers as sixth, I think it was, president of Guilford College. And that was, quite a remarkable time. Some of you who were on faculty and staff remember a lot of the energy that he brought. I was on the admissions staff at Earlham College at the time that Bill became president in 80. And, we were struggling to get enrollment at the time. We were having some issues with the upper administration at Earlham. And I remember seeing that picture of Bill Rogers throwing a frisbee on campus to students, and we're going, how did we miss him? I mean, he had taught at Earlham for 7 years. He had those close connections, and we missed him. But we were quite jealous of Earlham in the 80s when you got Bill. And Bill served until 1996. And his sister's right there. You can probably tell much more about Bill's tenure at Guilford, which really was quite remarkable in terms of encouraging, diversifying the student body and faculty, the new library, and that library move alone was miraculous. They decided it was going to be too expensive to get a professional company to move all those books. And they organized, now who's the person who organized that? Was it Jim Newland, or who organized the book move? Jim Newland? But students and staff, faculty, Bill moved every one of those books and evidently got them in the right place. And it's quite remarkable. It got national attention, I think. Now, one of the more interesting things I was still hearing about when I first came down here in 1990 that occurred in the 80s here locally, right across the street, was the cleaner incident. I was still hearing about this and again, some of you can give the detail. June 3rd, 1985, Fritz and Susie Clinner loaded up the Chevy Blazer with 2 children. I think they were in the apartments that used to be called Friendly Hills. Now, I don't know what they call them now, but right there next to Harris Teeter. And evidently careening through the intersection of Friendly and New Garden and Guilford College, bullets flying, drove on out to Summerfield, where it found out later they had poisoned and shot the 2 children in the back seat and then blew up the Blazer while they were being chased by the law enforcement folk. Evidently, this is, when I looked this up online, 32-year-old Clinner murdered Susie's parents, Fritz's own aunt and uncle, Susie's grandmother, and Susie's ex-mother-in-law and ex-sister-in-law. And as police pursued them, again, poisoned the 10 and 9-year-old boys, shot them, and then blew up the Blazer. Any of you remember that incident? I think you would remember it. Any other details about that I'm missing? Yeah.
I don't remember details, but I just remember it happened.
You could hear the gunfire in New Garden where I happened to be.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
That brings back memories to me. I remember I was coming out Friendly, going west, And all of a sudden, there were all these police cars around me. I thought, what on earth is going on?
Huh.
And they were turning from West Barker Street, over Friendly Road, onto the New Garden right ahead of me. And I didn't know what was going on, but it's always been interesting. The stories always been interesting.
See your car? Yeah.
Was he a Quaker?
I'm not. Was he a fake doctor too?
Doctor, but there was one policeman injured,
Yeah.
and he also had a dog in it.
Oh, well, there's a dog in the car as well.
And doctor in Rainsville.
Okay, your father was a doctor in Reedsville. Wow.
Was
Yes, Susie.
Susie Sharp.
Sharp.
That's very important.
Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of backstory to their relationship. It sounds like they were related too. They were cousins. What about this?
His father was a med student at Duke.
Oh yeah.
And the father had graduated from Duke. So after he went back and told his dad he had finished med school, his father got very upset that he didn't get the diploma.
Huh.
Wrote to the med school, whoever was head of that at Duke, wanted to know why the diploma hadn't come for his son to finish. And he had to write him back and said, Dr. Clarence, your son did not attend.
That's the reason he didn't get a diploma. He never attended. You know, ever since they moved from Trinity, it's been downhill all the way over there at Durham.
Better blood.
That's blood, yeah. For those who want more information, who wrote that? Jerry Bledsoe, Bitter Blood. Bitter Blood. Yeah, that was published in '88, I think. So good details. Well, good to get these firsthand accounts of what I was still hearing about when I came in '80, because people would often comment about the excitement there at the intersection as cars careened. Well, another, at least for me, significant event that happened in 1989 was that the advisory committee of Friends Center decided to start a campus ministry program. And against her better judgment, Judith Harvey interviewed me, and I wound up coming down as the campus ministry coordinator of that new program. So you can blame Judy and Bill Rogers, who gave me the phone call that we received up in Philadelphia in April, I think, of '90. I'm grateful. I'm not sure about the college. World events. Now, again, you remember the '80s. It's not like it was a boring decade. Of course, it started off with the shocking, at least to many people, election of Ronald Reagan. Shortly after Margaret Thatcher became prime minister in '79 in England. So the beginning of quite a transformation of world politics. And I was, again, at Earlham in 1980 at the time of Ronald Reagan's election. And if you think Guilford's a bubble, you know, Earlham was really a bubble. Politically, it was, pretty much aligned with, the Democratic Party in terms of who faculty and most of the students would have voted for or supported. Jimmy Carter was very popular on campus because he had nixed the B-1 bomber. He had, that, moral kind of stature, and very popular. And, to our knowledge, I mean, Ronald Reagan sure had been governor of California, but we knew him mostly as a B-movie actor. And, the nickname for Reagan for a lot of students was Ronnie Ray Guns, because he appeared to be a bit more militaristic than even the former Navy officer Jimmy Carter. So his election came as a shock to Earlham folk, because with a few exceptions, nobody at Earlham knew anybody who voted for Ronald Reagan. So it really was quite a shock. And it just so happened that even previous to the election, William Sloane Coffin Jr. had been invited to give a talk at Earlham for their weekly convocation. And again, most of you remember William Sloane Coffin, who was the Yale chaplain during the 60s, peace activist. He is the model for the campus minister at Walden College in Doonesbury, because the cartoonist went to Yale, when William Sloane Coffin Jr. was the chaplain there with his bullhorn leading anti-war protests and things like that. And I remember attending that convocation in Goddard Auditorium at Earlham, and William Sloane Coffin picked up on the deep depression, literally was palpable on campus, of these students and others who just couldn't believe this had happened. And he gave this stem winder of a talk, deconstructing the policies that got Reagan elected, and ended his talk literally with, "Be not discouraged, God is not mocked, this too shall pass." Students rose as of one, yelling and screaming and applauding, and spirits were lifted. As I walked out of Goddard Auditorium behind two old, crusty, conservative faculty members, I heard one turn to the other and say, "Thank goodness he didn't ask the students to jump off Carpenter Hall. They all would have done it." But it was, the decade started off that way, at least at Earlham. But Reagan and Reaganomics had a huge impact on the economy, on the culture, and I think we're still seeing the impact of that sea change in American politics in America. But it was also a decade of the development of that alliance we've referred to before between the Republican Party and evangelical Christians, which became decisive in the power of the Republican Party as statistically a minority party to win the elections and pursue the policies they've been able to. And that's when you saw the rise of the 700 Club, Pat Robertson's organization, the PTL Club. Jim and Tammy were puppeteers for the 700 Club before they went off with their own organization. The Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell and the Christian Coalition, all of that rose to prominence and power in the 1980s. And it was also the decade of the Southern Baptist takeover, the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And one of the first experiences I had down here at Guilford in 91, Paige Patterson became the dean of the Southeastern Seminary in the town of Wake Forest, where Wake Forest used to be, the college. And as is normal for those sorts of coronations and investitures, invitations went out to colleges and universities to send presidents or others to the inauguration. Bill Rogers called me up and said, "I have no interest in going to the inauguration of Paige Patterson." Paige Patterson and Judge Paul Pressler in 1979 engineered the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And Bill was not interested in going to this inauguration. "Would you like to go?" I said, "Well, sure, why not?" And the chaplain from Greensboro College and I, sat in fetal position, sucking our thumbs at the back of the chapel of the old Wake Forest University, now the seminary, as this, honest to goodness, triumphalist takeover was celebrated, because this was kind of the crown jewel of the seminary system of the Southern Baptist Convention. And it was remarkable to watch this celebration of kind of the culmination of this power, now politically and religiously, that was being experienced with that combination. And one of the things I remember was as part of the celebration, one of the people up on the stage was talking about the remarkable change of kind of the conversion of this old campus of Wake Forest University into the seminary, and kind of an exorcising of the demons of that old liberal arts college into the seminary. And he literally read from the catalog of the Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. And I still remember the first sentence. Wake Forest is and he put the emphasis on, liberal arts college. Again, the emphasis on we're not that anymore. Thank you, Bill, for sending me off to that. That was also the decade of the Iran-Contra affair, civil war down in Central America, and we'll refer to that in a moment in terms of Quaker response to that. The decade began again with the air controllers strike, one of the first instances that we saw of a change in understanding about relationship to unions and government control. The war in Central America, many refugees from that. Then Falklands War, and again that took a lot of us by surprise. I mean, really, we have a modern war between England and the United Kingdom and Argentina over this little island. And you all remember, the ships and the planes, and none of us really thought this would happen in the modern age, but it did. It did, and it played out again on cable news, because guess what else started in the 80s? CNN and cable news, and this became a thing. And if you weren't paying attention to CNN, you might have been tuned into MTV, because that started in the 80s as well. And what was the first song played on MTV? Video Killed the Radio Star. Video killed the radio star. Don't get me singing, but it wasn't all awful in terms of some of the worst things, the wars, the civil wars, the Falklands War, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Iran hostages were released on Inauguration Day here, but they were held into the early 80s. But it was the year of the Miracle on Ice. Remember the Winter Olympics of 1980, and we beat the Soviet Union in ice hockey. And many of you remember the countdown of the announcer. Who was the announcer at the time? But do you believe in miracles? And all of the celebration of Jim Craig and all those folks. I don't think any of them really made it in professional hockey, but boy, did they have their time in the sun in the Olympics. But it was short-lived, because that summer there was a boycott of the Summer Olympics because they're going to be held in the Soviet Union, and the United States boycotted because of the invasion of Afghanistan. And then in retaliation, in 1984, when Peter Ueberroth saved the Olympics in LA, the Soviet Union boycotted them. So it was a decade of boycotts. One of the awful things that happened in the 80s, if wars weren't enough, was the beginning of the AIDS crisis, the AIDS epidemic. And again, very few people understood what was happening here. They finally figured it out. And it was initially, seen as a homosexual disease. And of course, this played into a lot of the politics as well. And some of you may have gotten those direct mails, from folk talking about this is, God's curse on homosexuality. Became very political. It got very personal for our family up in Indiana when the Ryan White issue came along. Now, remember, Ryan White was a young boy who contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. He was a hemophiliac. He was in 8th grade, and his family moved into my home school district. of Rushville, Indiana. My brother was the chair of the Board of Education. And the story I get from my brother Dan is that they are notified that Ryan White is coming into the school district and wants to enroll that fall in classes. And they told him that he had AIDS. Well, we didn't know much about AIDS at the time. Do you get it from drinking fountains, from tears? I mean, how do you contract it? We're still figuring that out. But they knew it to be a communicable disease. Indiana had a law at the time, probably still does. You cannot enroll a student in a classroom with a known communicable disease. So Dan and the school board contact the state health officer and say, what's your ruling on this? Is AIDS a communicable disease? And if it is, what do we do about this student who wants to enroll? The state health officer is a political appointee. He wasn't going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so the Board of Education had to make their own decision. They consulted their lawyers, and their lawyers said, you're going to get sued either way. If you admit him, people are going to sue you for violating state law. If you don't, you're going to get sued for discriminating against this boy. And Dan, as a chair, said that we had to make the decision based on state law. And so they set him up with virtual education. Now, virtual education in the mid-80s is a telephone line. But they did what they could to keep him in school from his home in Kokomo. Well, this became national news, that this, backwoods country hick school board has denied this boy opportunity for education. And Elizabeth Taylor, Michael Jackson, Elton John, I mean, the whole panoply of Hollywood stars and other stars lined up in support of Ryan White. And my brother tells me that he'd be out on the farm and his wife, Ann, would call him in. NBC's on the phone, they want to talk to you. Chicago Tribune's on the phone, they want to talk to you. And he said, growing up, if I'd ever thought that I'd be talking to Time and Newsweek and New York Times, I would have said, wow, not anymore. It turned into a disaster, certainly publicly, for the school board and the reputation of Western High School. And quite personally, it turned Dan, an Earlham graduate, from the community liberal and progressive into an arch conservative, because he saw how the media operated and how the media took a story and ran with their own storyline. And their storyline was kind of like, Flash Dance, not Flash Dance, but what's the one Kevin Bacon's in about Footloose, backwoods conservative folk against all that's holy. And it had a huge impact on Dan and his family, because that sense of the unfairness of how the media often portrays things sent them careening into a very different political and social and cultural understanding. It was also a time of an interesting election in 1988. You remember Ronald Reagan has done his 2 terms, and it's George Bush versus, what's his name? Greek from Massachusetts. Dukakis, right. I was thinking of Olympia Dukakis, but I couldn't pull his name. And many of you remember that parodied on Saturday Night Live as Dana Carvey represented George Bush and John Lovitz represented Michael Dukakis. And Dana Carvey, as comedy writers will do, was up there, 1,000 points of light, stay the course, gotta be prudent, And John Lovitz, as Michael Dukakis, looks in the camera and says, "Can't believe I'm losing to this guy." It was a classic sketch. But the other drama involved in that election had to do with a Miami Herald reporter who was camped out outside another candidate's apartment in Washington, D.C., a guy by the name of Gary Hart, who was the front runner for a while, and noticed this young woman was spending the weekends with this married politician, young woman named Donna Rice. And that was the end of Gary Hart's campaign. That's how things were different only 30, 40 years ago. That wouldn't cause a ripple now. We elect folk with that kind of track record now. I mean, it's just, it's fascinating how things have changed culturally and politically. It was also the decade of the musical campaigns against hunger. We Are the World, Live Aid, massive concerts with all those famous singers and Dan Aykroyd singing together, and concerts in huge stadiums to raise money for famine relief. It was also a period of the decline and eventual fall of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, any of you hear him when he came as a Brian series? Again, growing up in Indiana, where a lot of stuff in the book of Revelation is taken very seriously and literally by folk. I knew folk who were absolutely convinced that he was the Antichrist because he had that mark on his forehead. That was the mark of the beast. And he winds up, with perestroika, glasnost, kind of opening the Soviet Union to the West, and the Berlin Wall falls. And we had Guilford students over there at the time. The Munich program, Germany program, it was a remarkable experience. It was the decade when the first woman became a Supreme Court justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. The first woman went into space, Sally Ride, but also the Challenger explosion. And it's one of those things that most people know exactly where they were when that news came about. Home computers and the World Wide Web, only 40-some years ago. I remember starting my doctoral dissertation on a legal yellow pad. First 2 chapters on legal pad. And my wife said, there's this technology that's just been developed. And she got our first computer. And I didn't know anything of how to operate the blame thing. She kind of held my hand through it. Finally wrote the dissertation. Hadn't saved any of it. And a week after I handed it in, the computer crashed. But Guilford may have been saved from having me come. But that would have been the end of my PhD. Also, for you sports fans, 1982, UNC wins this national championship with some freshman taking a shot from the wing, Michael Jordan. Next year, 1983, NC State wins the national championship. And again, for me personally, 88, 89 was significant because that was the summer of the outbreak of the Palestinian Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising. And I went over that summer of 88, 89 to about 88 it was, to witness what was happening. And it was just remarkable because earlier, when I was there teaching 70 to 72 in Palestine, there was no response really to the Israeli occupation that happened in 1967. They were waiting for the UN, for the world community to respond. And so they were just kind of waiting for the world to correct what they felt was, the mistake of this military occupation of Palestine. And because they were in mourning, having lost, the West Bank, I never saw the traditional folk dance. I never saw a traditional wedding. There was no celebration, none, because we were in mourning, and that's part of what we do in deep despair and mourning. When I went back in '79 with our first work trip, none of that. There's just deep depression, still waiting for the world to act. And by '88, they said, we're taking matter in our own hands. And part of what we will do is use nonviolent strategies. 95% of the actions of that first Palestinian uprising were nonviolent. Tax refusal, strikes, curfews, and making Palestinian flags and flying them, which is illegal. Cleaning out their cisterns, getting off the Israeli water system and public grid, cleaning up their lanterns and getting off the electric grid, and dancing and celebrating their culture. And it was just remarkable to see that. And that led directly to the Madrid talks and eventually to Oslo and the Oslo Accords that were supposed to be an interim 5-year arrangement towards an independent Palestinian state next to Israel, which didn't happen. But while I was there in '88 during the Intifada, the PLO announced we are going to recognize Israel on the 78% of historic Palestine that they occupied in '48, and we'll, in exchange, accept a Palestinian state on the remaining 22% with a capital in East Jerusalem. And when I came back from that summer and told that to my friends in Philadelphia, where I was teaching at Friends Central School, nobody believed it. There's no way this is going to happen. And when it did happen that November, for a brief shining moment, people believed me when I told them something. That quickly passed too. But and then one other event in the '80s that many of you will remember is Hands Across America. Any of you participate in Hands Across America? Yeah. Whereabouts? Where were you? Los Angeles? Yeah. You didn't quite reach here. It didn't quite link up everywhere, but there were long, long lines of people in Hands Across America. Wrapping up, how did Quakers respond to all of this? Well, in the '80s, not because of the changing political and cultural landscape, but in part because of some of this, membership in the Society of Friends North, at least the Religious Society of Friends in North America, began declining. It wasn't yet because of the culture wars. Some of those are beginning to happen because now we're talking publicly about homosexuality. We're talking publicly about same-sex marriage. We're talking publicly about some of these issues. And folk who kind of kept their beliefs hidden, because we didn't talk about it, all of a sudden have to start talking about it. And eventually in the '90s and more recently, that has led to essentially the dissolution of several yearly meetings. But the decline in membership really started because of economics. In the '60s and into the '70s, in large swaths of American Quakerdom, folk were rural and agricultural, lived on small farms, had large families, milked cows, and that was just a natural funnel into the local meeting. And over decades and generations of just natural growth and natural membership from folk in these small communities, Quakers, forgot how to not necessarily evangelize, but do outreach. They didn't have to. There's just a natural flow into the meeting. And they forgot in many places how to be uniquely or distinctly Quaker. They assimilated largely into the Protestant mainstream. And so when the economy changed in the '70s and you no longer had those small farms, large families, my home meeting went from 150 in a decade to 25. And that happened in many, many places. And they looked around, okay, what do we do now? And they looked at the mega churches that had developed, and they had become quite an industry. Mega churches everywhere. It's very popular technology and music and praise bands and all of that. And so many friends, many said, well, that's what we got to do. We got to copy what's working elsewhere. But we can never outdo those folk at what they do best. And gradually, it just led to, my yearly meeting in Indiana went from about 14,000 people to now about 2,000. Indiana yearly meeting went from one time, they had 30,000 people in the 1800s to about 2,000. And we've seen that throughout the country. Now, worldwide, Quakers are growing because of Kenya and South America, where about half of the world's Quakers now reside. 49% in Kenya and Rwanda and Uganda alone, and growing by leaps and bounds in Bolivia and in Central America. And as I alluded, there were major debates in the 80s over those hot potato issues: homosexuality, New Age theology, liberalism versus conservatism, views of the Bible. And right here at Guilford College, in one of the triennials, and I don't know if any of you were involved with it, there was a late night, midnight minute that folk from the different factions of FUM, recognizing that, we got a problem here with our disparate views, came together and wrote a minute, seeking kind of reconciliation and understanding of each other. It lasted a few years, but one of the major issues became the Richmond Declaration of Faith. And again, we're talking in-house here, but the Richmond Declaration of Faith was written in 1887 in Richmond, Indiana, by the Gurneyite faction of the Orthodox faction of Quakerism in North America. So it was a slice of Quakerdom. And there was an attempt to be, okay, after the Civil War and those Wesleyan revivals that swept through, we now have pastors, we now have programmed worship, we've got people advocating for baptism and communion. Who are we? What do we believe? What does unite us? And so these Gurneyite yearly meetings assembled for 3 days in Richmond, Indiana in 1887 and cranked out this statement of, okay, here's what you can do. Here's what we still believe. You still have strong peace testimony. They still opposed the outward ordinances, but allowed for pastors and music. And it's kind of a compromise sort of a thing. Alan Jay loved it. Mary Bennet Hall Hobbs hated it. And they were good friends, but they could still be friends, even though they disagreed tremendously over this Richmond Declaration of Faith. Mary Hobbs said, it's a creed. Alan Jay said, no, it's just a statement of attempting of reconciliation. Well, over the years, it became a creed. And the debate in Quakerdom, in Fringe United meeting circles, of which most Quakers here are mostly affiliated, was, do we reaffirm the Richmond Declaration of Faith because it had a very strong view, a high view of Scripture, almost into inerrancy. And that then was used to decide debates about homosexuality, same-sex marriage, those sorts of cultural issues. And that continued into North Carolina yearly meeting in many of our memories of, do we reaffirm the Richmond Declaration of Faith? And when people would be pushed, they said, why are you so fixated on this 1887 document? It was because it had a high view of Scripture. And then if you reaffirm it with that high view of Scripture, then you use that to settle these other debates, which it didn't. And eventually, again, the yearly meeting dissolved a few years ago. And same thing happened in many other yearly meetings. The last thing I'll mention is another thing that happened over at Guilford College in 1985. Some of you may have been at that, and that was the World Gathering of Young Friends. How many were at that? that was evidently a definitive gathering in Quaker history, because that gathering of young friends for many was the first time they met those other kinds of Quakers. Program Quakers met those program Quakers for the first time, and vice versa, international friends. And out of that, came a next generation of Quaker leaders. Now they're all aging out now, but that 1985 World Gathering of Young Friends over at Guilford College was decisive in preparing another generation of leadership. Uh, I think humbly, the Quaker Leadership Scholars Program over at Guilford is doing that somewhat now and cranking out new leaders. But that 1985 gathering was really, really quite an event. So that's pretty much the 80s. And no wonder you've decided we're done with now the 90s and the OOs. Too much to take in. Anything you would add to any of that?
Got one little island, Grenada.
Oh yeah, Grenada. Yeah, I forgot about. I'm sure I forgot a lot of stuff.
Or
Yeah, Grenada. And again, one of those things that no one would believe that in the modern era we do this. We invade places. We have wars over these things. I remember with the Falklands War, when I was an Earl, some were saying, why don't they just pit the Argentina and the English national soccer teams, and whoever wins the game wins the. I mean, really, we go to war over these things? But yeah, was that when Noriega? Or was that in the 90s? When did we blast rock music at Noriega in is that Nicaragua? Yeah. Well, during that, one thing I did forget about the Quaker response was during the crisis of the Civil War in Central America. Friendship Meeting was a sanctuary meeting, and they hosted refugees, from Central America. Were any of you involved in any of that planning or hosting? It was kind of under the radar because you couldn't admit what you were doing because it was illegal. But it was likened to the Underground Railroad. That this is a modern day Underground Railroad of hosting those refugees. Well, thank you for hanging out for these 5 decades now. Yeah.
The folks in Indiana, to a large extent, were they immigrants from North Carolina Quakerism?
Yeah. Yeah. The question was, those Quakers up in Indiana, were they immigrants from North Carolina, so to speak? Yeah. And if you take a look, if you take a look at a map of Indiana that has place names, county names, and includes surnames, you'd think you're back in North Carolina. Randolph County, Wayne County, Henry County, there's Greensboro, Plainfield, Rich Square, and the surnames are Mendenhall, Osborne, Winslow, White. We ship thousands of North Carolina scalawags up there, and a few of them started coming back. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, what happened was, again, is anti-slavery and economics. Economics played a huge role in it. After 100 years of farming clay without modern scientific agricultural practice, we had played out the dirt, and deep loam beckoned up there. So economics was a major factor, but the anti-slavery piece of it was too. And Stephen B. Weeks, in his classic book, Southern Quakers and Slavery, says the major reason was, slavery. But the Quakers who went up there initially, settled in the areas that were freed by treaties with Indians. So it's a gradual process of working their way across Indiana. There's a slice of it early 1800s because of the Treaty of Greenville. Richmond was in that. And then bit by bit, my family settled in the 1840s in the Miami Reserve, the Miami Indians by treaty. And bit by bit, Indiana opened up. And the big funnel became National Road. which was engineered from near Baltimore, Maryland, to Vandalia, Illinois, near St. Louis. And it was the national road opening up, the Midwest, engineered by a Pennsylvania Quaker, Jonathan Knight. And as he worked that road through Indiana, who did he know? He knew Quakers. Who did he purchase land from? Quakers. So that's the route of National Road. And then that became the route that Quakers followed going in Indiana. So on either side of I-70, US 40 National Road, you got North Carolina Quakerdom. Yeah. Including Plainfield, whose basketball team is still called the Quakers. Del Harris, great NBA coach, played for the Plainfield Quakers before he coached for Earlham. And the headquarters still of Western Early Meeting. Well, anyway, thank you very much. I'll hang out at lunch. Thank you. And if you have further corrections, additions, complaints, you'll know where to find me.